Today in Rabbles, the trans feminine allegory, the dangers of mystification, materialist trans feminism, and much more. With Emma Heaney.
Welcome everyone to this conversation with Professor Emma Heaney. Ida and I have been really excited about this opportunity because over the past few months, we've been having informal chats about the entry of trans theorizing into international studies. So what form it's taken, where it's headed, what the stakes are. And Emma's work has been really just such an invaluable resource for us to think these things through. The reason is because that we've observed that many critical scholars within our field have treated transgender people in an allegorical way. And what I mean by this is that many have been more interested in how trans can serve as some sort of figurative exposition of various phenomena of trans nationalism or trans boundary politics than in the actual conditions of trans life. So we see many pieces in recent years that find within trans theory certain heuristic tools through concepts like passing and transitioning and liminality, visibility, crossing, all sorts of metaphors that can contribute to the study of statecraft and migration, war, genocide. The list is very, very long. And Emma has made one of the richest contributions to the study of the theoretical and methodological and political uses of the word trans. And we thought this event would be just a fantastic opportunity for us to learn from her and to reflect on what trans theorizing in international studies is currently and should be. So that by way of an introduction, I'll hand over to Ida to start us off.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's really, really lovely to see so many of you today, and friends and colleagues and students. Thanks for coming. I'm really, really excited to introduce today's megastar, the superstar, the center of this event, which is Emma Heaney. Emma Heaney is an assistant professor in the Department of English at William Paterson University. She's the author of The New Woman, Literary Modernism, Queer Theory, and the Trans Feminine Remainder. It was published by Northwestern University Press in 2017, and she is currently editing a collection of essays that address the relation of cisness to feminism. And Emma's book, The New Woman, is really the reason we're all here. So the book traces the creation and the significance of the trans feminine as an allegorical figure from its origins in late 19th century sexological writing to subsequent writings in the field of psychoanalysis, modernist fiction, and contemporary queer theory. For me, it was honestly an extremely eye-opening read, and I implore all of you to go read it after this event. Okay, so Emma, let's start. I was thinking it might be helpful as a way of sort of introducing your work to approach the idea of the trans feminine allegory by allowing you to historicize it. So where does it come from? Yeah. Because in your book, the role of late 19th century, you say that you argue that sexology makes sex cis. And so I wondered what you meant by that, and if you can kick us off.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to do that. Thanks so much to Ida and Alex for inviting me, and to Tomato for the help with prep. I'm calling in today from the so-called Borough of Queens in New York City, which is the unceded tribal territory of the Matidinock, the Rockaway, the Maspeth, and the Canarsie indigenous nations, first colonized by the Dutch and the English in the 17th century, and in perpetuity named for a queen who never set foot here, who didn't know anything about this place. And today, Queens is one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse places on earth, site of both great violence and great resistance to the ongoing process of colonization, and not unrelatedly, as I'll talk about today, to vibrant trans life and resistance. A place where Queens means something very different and more relevant to us in its trans feminine legacy and usage. So I just wanted to start with this land acknowledgement, and by saying that it struck me that from one Queens to another, the places we're connecting from are linked by this history of migration and colonization and violence, and this knot of power and resistance that is our subject of conversation today. So I just want to start out with that land acknowledgement. So now to Ida's question. What do I mean in my book when I say sexology made sex cis? What is this historical argument that I'm making? And I thank you for this question, because I think it's the most important contribution of the book and not the one that often is first sort of noticed. So I'm going to start by talking about what I meant in the book, and then I'm going to talk about how my understanding has deepened in the years since its publication, mostly through absorption of the scholarship of Black studies scholars, Indigenous studies scholars, trans studies scholars, and post-colonial feminist scholars. So my original point. So we're used to thinking of cisness as an identity, right? One is cis if one is not trans. One has a cis body if one doesn't have a trans body, right? But in my book, I'm arguing that cisness is more accurately understood as the ideology that sorts us into these two categories. Cisness is the belief that for almost everyone, for the vast majority of people, one or another set of qualities adhere to our bodies at birth based on the appearance of our genitals, either at or before birth with imaging technology. And that diagnosis can then be confirmed, or it can be complicated by hormonal investigation of our bodies or chromosomal investigation of our bodies. But cisness is belief in that link, right? This belief produces a understanding, a reality, whereby if this compulsory set of gendered characteristics don't adhere to you, then you're viewed as gender nonconforming. And if that non-adherence is extreme enough, then you count as trans, right? And there's a whole diagnostic to determine whether you count as trans. And this ideology may sound like just facts to many of us, but it's the work of my book to show that it's not facts historically. That cisness, this ideological connection between bodily structures and personal attributes, in fact, is an ideology that disciplines us all. So the next question, how did this ideology of cisness come to be? Where did it emerge historically? So this diagnostic framework originated in the field of sexology, a broad field that changed over time. In the 1860s, which is sort of the origin of sexology, there are some previous ones, as Benji Kahan has talked about, but in the 1860s, the first widely known sexologist, whose name was Karl Ulrichs, created a diagnostic figure to explain the fact that men desire men, right? And this diagnostic figure, he expressed in Latin, was called such men have an anima mulibris virile corpore inclusa, right? A woman's soul trapped in a man's body, right? 1860. Then gradually in the 19th century, as in the end of the 19th century, the idea of homosexuality, the idea of object choice was disarticulated from the idea of extreme inversion, the idea of being of this sex misalignment. And the idea of transness came out of this disarticulated remainder from the primary project of explaining why men desire men. And it was medicalized separately and eventually became the clinical criteria for establishing surgical and hormonal healthcare by the 1920s, right? If you were trapped in the wrong body, then you could access these healthcare avenues. But through this development, transness retained that original relation to the critical metaphor of mismatched bodies, even though its history as a critical metaphor for desire between men was effaced, right? We no longer think of that as and in fact, there was sort of this sense that I'm so glad that we've realized now that gay people can be cis, right? In the early 20th century, there was this relief expressed. So by the 20th century, sexology was more firmly established as a medical science, in which doctors amassed case studies of gender and sexual minorities that distinguished the fetishist from the masochist, from the homosexual, from the trans person, and so on. And of course, being trans was one of these categories. But to be clear, this formation was almost exclusively a bourgeois phenomenon, right? In the 1880s and 90s, sexologists, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, chief among them, started to make a distinction between congenital perversion or inversion, meaning inborn, or acquired, meaning you got it from living a low life with low people, right? And these two branches then set two different class standards for how people would be treated, right? A bourgeois person would be more likely to be treated as a congenital sufferer of a condition and then medicalized, whereas working class and poor people would be more likely to be accused, tasked with the idea that they had acquired it and therefore they could help it, and therefore it was something that could be criminalized, right? So when we think about the Oscar Wilde trial, for instance, in 1895, which people think of as this like watershed, it's not that he was gay that was significant. It's not that he was criminalized for being gay that he was significant. It was that he was criminalized for being bourgeois and gay, right? Because of course the rent boys and the trans feminine fairies who circulated in queer life were always going to jail, for decades before that. So anyway, so this classed parallel tracks persisted through the 20th century, with many working class and poor trans people living in their identified sex, irrespective of medical intervention, or in later decades, sort of piecemeal accessing medical intervention, hormones and surgeries where they could find them, and largely, often with only sort of vague knowledge of the medical diagnostic of being diagnosed as trans and then being allowed this sort of transformation. Meanwhile, bourgeois trans people were either closeted or, tenaciously pursued these few medical avenues where transition was available, or trans medical health care was available. So what chapter 4 of my book emphasizes is that the archived documents among working class and poor people, that the idea of changing sex or being trapped in the wrong body was not a primary way through which people talked about their experience of transness. So I wanted to just, if I may, share two examples from my book to show you what I mean. So the first one is from the sexological compendium, The Transvestites, collected and published by Magnus Hirschfeld in 1910. And it's the story of a trans woman who was born and left home because her parents died. Her parents let her dress as a girl, but then her aunts wouldn't. And so she hit the road and she traveled all the way to San Francisco by the end of her life. But this is how she talked about her life. And I'm interspersing quotes from her with my own writing here. So in Switzerland, she left Austria for Switzerland. Case 13, which is what she's identified in his book, supported herself as a nanny and by doing housework and embroidery. While thus employed, her mistress discovered her trans status, but, quote, did not make a big fuss about it because she'd never had such a good woman worker. This mistress also encouraged her trans feminine employee to go out and dance and meet young people and live, right? At the age of 16, she is raped while employed there. And the man who rapes her says, I'm going to tell everybody you're a hermaphrodite if you tell anybody that I did this to you. So she goes to Paris, where she found work as a domestic servant and, quote, came together with women who lived with other women like married people, which in France is a rather widespread custom. And while she's sort of in the social circle, she's living with these lesbian women, and one of them sort of investigates her body in the night and discovers her trans status. And in the morning, she's very upset that she's discovered her trans status. And the girl says, you don't need to be ashamed, quote, there are other girls like you. I know of other girls like you. So you see already the way in which this trans woman's life, that her experiences, her employment, her vulnerability to sexual assault, her position within feminized socialities is present, right? Are the defining characteristics of her life, not the idea that she's trapped in the wrong body and someday might attain femininity or womanhood. Right. Another example is from 8 years later, and in New York City, one of the first trans feminine memoirs by
Emma.
Yeah.
Emma, sorry to interrupt. There's a few people in the chat wanting you to slow down a little bit.
Oh, sure. Okay. Sorry, guys. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry. Okay. So in this memoir, this subject, Jenny June is the name she went by, is a Columbia undergraduate and from upstate New York. And she comes to the city and she starts living kind of a double life where she's a bourgeois, trouser wearing undergraduate uptown. And then she takes the subway down to the Bowery, which is downtown, the working class and poor neighborhood of Manhattan. Well, one of them. And she lives her trans feminine life. And that's really interesting. And it's interesting to follow her whole story. But what I wanted to bring to you was this vignette that she talks about of the women that she meets in the Bowery. 3 girls were introduced to me as Jersey Lily, Annie Laurie, and Grace Darling. 2 others had adopted the names of living star actresses. These were unreflecting and uneducated victims of innate androgynism. And having passed their lives exclusively in the slums of New York, they'd always been perfectly satisfied with the lot nature had ordained them. So with their trans status, with their bodies, with their lives, right? And so what we see in this passage is this conflict between a bourgeois identity that says, I've read the sexological literature, and people who have trans experience are trapped and they're innate victims, and there's a problem, right? And a working class and poor reality in the Bowery and other working class neighborhoods in New York City, where trans women named Lily and Annie and Grace were living their lives and participating in this reality of the generalized presence of trans feminine people in those communities. Okay, so I'll just recommend for more on, more of these kinds of stories. Emily Skidmore's True Sex, which you'll see here on the screen. C. Riley Snorton's Black on Both Sides, all recent books. Jules Gill Peterson's work, Histories of the Transgender Child, but also more particularly her work in progress, Gender Underground, A History of DIY. Okay. So despite this reality, from Ulrichs in 1860 to our present in 2021, medical gatekeepers have insisted on a unitary definition of trans life, right? The fundamental form of which is allegorical. A particular life story about entrapment and hiding and isolation is extrapolated from this metaphor of entrapment, and you're obliged to reproduce it if you want to get medical services often, right? Tell the story of when you first knew and this whole standardized life tale. So in a straightforward way, sexology made sex cis by ignoring the standard working class and poor recognition of identified sex, lived sex as real sex, and creating this ideology of cisness, the idea that there are 2 sexed experiences, being cis or being sadly trapped in non-cisness and desiring a prescribed regimen of healthcare as the avenue to achieve real sex, right? So that's where the line of thinking ended was sort of ending in my book. But I began since that time to be thinking about something that was present as a minor thread in my book. And that was the way that already, beginning in 1860, as sexology emerged as a discipline, there was already formed this idea of cisness by a pre-existing project of internal and external colonization that had the central concern of disciplining people and communities into the gender norms of the white Western European and American settler non-immigrant bourgeoisie. So in the so-called Americas, this looked like a campaign that began with colonial contact and continued through my period of study, to enforce gender roles, hairstyles, styles of dress, socialities onto Indigenous people that reflected European bourgeois norms of how men and women should behave, should dress, wear trousers, have short hair if you're a boy, likewise, ideas about modesty and so on for girls and women. And this is what I wanted to say about that. This is what I've been thinking with other scholars since the publication of my book. This kind of enforcement was done both on two-spirit Indigenous people. So these are arranged, it's a contemporary term that draws together different kinds of Indigenous gender experiences that had different words based on nation and linguistic tradition. So two-spirit people were called Bote in the Crow tradition in the Plains, and they were called Mahu in Hawaiian Indigenous culture. They were called Wawe in Zuni culture. So that this enforcement, the forcible cutting of hair being the most sort of iconic of them, but also on non-two-spirit Indigenous people. So just boys and girls and men and women. An example comes to me from this memoir by Zikla Sa about going to a boarding school as part of a de-Indianification process in the 1890s, where all of the children were lined up and their hair was cut when they arrived. So the commonality of treatment between two-spirit Indigenous people and non-two-spirit Indigenous people gets at exactly the way that colonization was targeting the non-cisness of Indigenous life, right? As a racialized imperative, right? So that is already present when sexologists start making these claims about structures and eventually hormones and chromosomes. The historian Afsina Najmabadi, whose book I have here, traces this trajectory in Iranian history in the same period, from the late 18th century through the early 20th. In her book, she shows that Iranian elites, as they came under the sort of gaze of British and French visitors in the 18th and 19th century, started to slough off or disappear this totally socially accepted category, which was called Amrad, which was a male-assigned beautiful beloved, a beautiful male-assigned beloved, because this became a site of discomfort because of the imposition of the idea that physical genital morphological difference was the sole relevant social distinction, and that society had to be organized around that genital distinction, right? Or another people that are really helping me to think about this are Durba Mitra's Indian Sex Life and Gayatri Reddy's With Respect to Sex, which talk about, Reddy talks about the regulation of Hijra populations in South Asia, and Mitra talks about the way in which ideas about sex workers were regulated. And this is, again, the similarity or the really imbricatedness of these two processes shows the way in which cisness itself was a colonial imposition. And as I said before, and this is what I mean by internal colonizations, this was also going on in working class neighborhoods in London and in New York, even as it was going on in colonized, well, those are, I mean, New York is a colonized place, but where bourgeois ideas through vice squads and police departments were being inflicted on communities. So as trans women were being, as my period of study goes on, more categorically criminalized for just being trans. Okay, so I think I'll stop there with the historical point. Yeah. Follow-ups.
Thanks, Emma. That's really interesting. And I think in the book, you sort of move on to also more kind of your critique of more contemporary scholarship. And so you really compellingly, I think, talk about how literary and especially queer theory colludes with, you say it colludes with cis ideology through its mobilization of this trans feminine allegory. So in these sections, you explore how, as a trans woman, is allegorized in order to recenter the experiences of cis people in these types of theoretical traditions, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning the trans woman vanishes in her own right. And so I wondered, I wondered, like, where else do you think we see the trans feminine allegory taken up in this particular way? And do you think this is sort of like endemic to cultural representations more broadly?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, my book is actually not primarily about identifying this as a literary, well, you see, I just talked all about it with hardly mentioning any literature at all, primarily a literary figure, but it, even though the literary uptake of it is like interesting and rich. But those authors that I write about for people, James Joyce, Juna Barnes, Aldous Huxley, T.S. Eliot, right? They were already coming to an allegorically laden trans feminine when they wrote their books in the early 20th century, or poems, right? So I'm arguing that it was set up in the medicalization of trans femininity, right? And that as I say, that imperative to produce the right story, to be identified as diagnostically trans, persists to this day. Although, it's still in the medical literature, even though individual practitioners are like moving away from it and like not requiring their patients to like memorize these ideas in order to attain care. But for our purposes today, I just prepared a couple of examples of ways that I saw this, the allegorical status of trans femininity in cis culture, proliferating and, in different ways. So people might be familiar with a sort of television and film genealogy that treats trans women's bodies as jokes, or treats, so here I'm thinking of like the film Mira Breckenridge, the novel and film Mira Breckenridge, The Crying Game, Ace Ventura, a good portion of the Saturday Night Live skits that were like produced from the 70s to the early aughts. I'm not sure how much you all around the world watch Saturday Night Live, but it's a big thing here in the States. Anyway, that very much sort of follows the script of the ways that cis women's bodies are presented as jokes, or made into jokes, with the sort of narrative revelation of genital status as a component of this tradition. Or the other main sort of tradition of representing trans women in film and television is as dead people, right? In sort of like crime, CSI franchise sort of shows. So a script in which trans women are sort of representative of like the gritty underbelly of cities, right? So maybe people are familiar with this genealogy because of the recent documentary film by Sam Feder called Disclosure, that sort of traces this genealogy in the 20th and 21st century. But my interest is not exactly in this genealogy, although I think what I'm talking about sort of obviously sets up that those really genocidal depictions, right? A sort of media landscape about trans women that would suggest that trans women are so farcical as to be non-existent, or actually dead, so non-existent, right? A sort of genocidal cultural landscape when it comes to depictions of trans women. My interest is in the sort of ideological claims that are grafted onto this allegorical idea of trans femininity. And what interested me about them in the book and since is the infinite flexibility of the meanings that are attached to trans women in this way. So by this I mean trans women are either a utopian promise of being free from sex, from the bounds of sex, or they're sort of presented as a dystopian, the sort of catastrophic end of sexual difference, right? The trans women are either too much woman, too much femininity. I'll show you examples to show you what I mean, but just to get the framework down, or too little, inadequate femininity, right? trans women are either the sort of technological future, or trans women are installed as being possessed of sort of a fundamentally anachronistic quality, always old-fashioned, always retrograde, always hearkening back. So like, this was my interest in this sort of flexibility that could say, well, I'll give you examples actually. So the first is, I just bring it up because it's a foundational example, which was the media depiction of Christine Jorgensen when she debuted in the post-World War II era. And the left-hand newspaper from the New York Daily News cover is the most famous cover about Jorgensen. Ex-GI becomes blonde beauty, operations transform Bronx youth, right? And so there was this whole media line about Jorgensen, that she was the future, that her body was like representing the technological advancements of the miracles of medicine, right? And then there were other headlines, another sort of cluster of headlines like this one from a Toronto newspaper that said, Christine Jorgensen, and here you see in these pictures, representative of the loneliest people in all the world, right? Trans people are the loneliest people in all the world. So you see, trans women represent fundamentally in their existence either an astounding technological innovation of the nuclear age, or they're ontologically bound to sort of loneliness and misery, right? These two very different tracks that again say, this is what trans women mean categorically, right? Okay, and this is the sort of this amazing article by the amazing historian and filmmaker Susan Stryker that talks about how that first track of talking about Christine Jorgensen was like connecting, she did to sex what the atomic bomb or like splitting the atom did to physics, like this sort of really extreme claims about the significance of her existence in public consciousness, right? We're to look at a more contemporary example here. Here's a widely circulated editorial from the New York Times from 2015 that took as its subject the reality television star and former Olympian Caitlyn Jenner, right? And it says, a new photo spread by this woman, Eleanor Burkett, right? A new photo spread and interview in Vanity Fair offered us a glimpse into Caitlyn Jenner's idea of a woman, a cleavage-boosting corset, sultry poses, thick mascara, etc. I won't bore you, but and you see the photograph, right, which is like men in trousers that taper at the ankle and fishnet stockings and like all of these sort of like anachronistic like 1950s version of femininity, right? And that's what Burkett is saying, like Caitlyn Jenner represents all of this gender and sex anachronism, right? And therefore trans women do, right? Nobody ever wrote an article saying about Kim Kardashian saying that somehow her display of femininity then says something categorical about me or other cis women, right? So we have that. Trans women are anachronism. Or from 1 year before, Laverne Cox on the cover of Time, the transgender tipping point, America's next civil rights frontier, right? So again, either trans women represent in their essence anachronism or the future, right? So so that's the sort of thing that I was getting at. More recently still, I just wanted to bring up this sort of air of the allegorization of trans women. So this is an article that was published in a magazine called Spare Rib, which I guess is a biblical allusion, by the philosophy professor Kathleen Stuck. And its title is Blackface is Evil, Why Isn't Drag? And so I just had a tiny screed to present to you on this subject. So the obvious answer to the titular question, blackface is evil, why isn't drag, is because blackface is a cultural practice that reproduced racist stereotypes of Black people using satire to manage the anxiety of white audiences and white societies that were, erasing the routinized sexual assault of Black women by white men and campaigns of vigilante terror to kill Black people, right? Blackface was what lynch mobs did in their spare time, right? Laughing at blackface. In contrast, drag is a form of feminine performance that originated as a venue for expressing trans femininity and different queer femininities, because such was dangerous to express in public. Drag always had an intimate relation of cross-fertilization with other modes of feminine performance, women as singers, dancers, vaudevillians, etc. So there are two different genealogies to these two different kinds of performance. But what my research can offer an analysis of this obscenely racist article is to talk about the way in which the conceptual underpinning of the racist article is that drag is extracted from its historical place in trans life and queer life and reduced to this idea of crossing or cross-dressing. That's the only basic, basis for the equation of these two very different cultural practices. And I say that the origin of this conceptual ordering is in the sexological allegory, right? Rather than recognizing trans life as a various field of cultural and social life, sexology reduces trans life to this idea of sex change or of crossing, a process of crossing over. So the diagnostic narrative and model sets up Stock's bad faith analysis, like 180 years later. So, and I just wanted to sort of end this series of examples by providing some scholarship that talks about the relation between Blackness and transness, the imbrication, the coextensive nature of Blackness and transness, the inextricability of those fields from a Black studies perspective. So work by Marquise Bay, Khayyam Green, Cameron Awkward-Rich, and Farah Thompson are all things that I recommend to you. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say about that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Those are really great illustrations that actually move us quite, it's a good segue into international studies to look at how the sort of what's happening here. Because as I mentioned in the introduction, the trans feminine allegory is used in international studies as well, but not so much to teach us about the category of sex, but to illuminate experiences of border crossing and of forced displacement and of national belonging, and so on. So what I want to ask you is this, is this best understood as an expansion or a use of the trans feminine allegory that you've charted in your work, or is this maybe something altogether new? I can give maybe more detailed examples if that's helpful.
Yeah, I need that in order to sort of comment because I'm not familiar with the literature yet.
Sure. So that's a good idea. So I've noted down some quotations from two prominent texts in international studies that deploy the trans feminine, and I think that shed light on how this appears in different ways. So what comes to mind immediately is a book called Queer International Relations, which is not the first text to engage with queer theory and IR, but is often credited with sort of inaugurating the field of queer international relations. And in that book, we find that the Eurovision Song Contest winner, Thomas Neuwirth, and his drag persona, Conchita Wurst, sort of become the central linchpin for the unfolding of the book's argument. So the author refers to this drag persona, Conchita Wurst, and I'm quoting, as a figure who defies traditional understandings of European integration across multiple axes, and so who is therefore illustrative of what she calls a queer logic of statecraft. I can't reconstruct the whole book's argument, but she concludes with the statement that, quote, Conchita Wurst makes possible a thorough rethinking of what the process of European integration might mean and what a sovereign integrated Europe might become. We can also look to the work of a migration scholar called Emma Bond, who in a chapter of her book that's called Transgender, Transnational, Crossing Binary Lines, she asks how, quote, the various manifestations of the trans body can function as a sign of disruption, of displacement, of being out of place. And so what she's doing is she's writing that what she calls the journey metaphor of transition can help us rethink categories of confinement, of traveling, of migration, and of home. And that more specifically, the experience of gender dysphoria can be, quote, productively extended to open up new debates around belonging and orientation, end quote. So we have a lot of examples, but those are sort of two, yeah.
Okay. Disruption, being out of. What did the Emma say about sign of disruption, sign of being out of what?
Sign of being out of place.
Out of place. Okay. So let's talk about those spatial claims, or the spatial claims of the first argument, and then the spatial metaphor employed in the second, right? So this idea, and I'm not too familiar with this performer or the Eurovision that you mentioned, but I'm assuming it's like a international drag competition, is it then? Okay. So the scholar, the place that I can help out in thinking about that scholar's critical metaphor. Well, first of all, we already noticed this setup, right? Drag or trans feminine performance is a figure for, represents X reality, right? And doing or making that claim, drag performance as a figure for outside, right, is extracted from the vibrant trans feminine histories of Germany or of, England or of France or wherever, right? And so that idea that that drag or transness provides an alterity or an outsideness is something that I would reject, not of course because cisness doesn't marginalize transness, but because to incorporate that that spatial metaphor of outside into your critical analysis is to repeat the cis marginalization of transness. Does that make sense, people? And again, this idea of crossing as being the definitional interest and nature of trans life is just not something, if you are thinking about trans life, not as a figure, but as a genealogy, is just not universal, right? It's crossing or changing is not inherent to every trans experience in the genealogy of trans experiences that we have access to, right? Or like are living for some of us. So in the second instance, this is helps me to make another point that I haven't made already. The idea that in a sort of utopian strain, the trans body can help us like a cis academic or intellectual formation as a sign of disruption or as a sign of breaking out of places that were previously sacrosanct, right? If you look at the genealogy of trans life, trans people occupied sex categories, right? Grace and Annie, who were doing sex work on the Lower East Side in the 1890s and 1900s, were with cis women, right? Were going home to abusive partners, were being put in jail alongside cis women sex workers, right? There was no freedom from the category of sex for these trans women, right? There was living as women, right? And being criminalized in different ways as trans women sometimes. But this is the other primary, multi-discipline notion that I think needs to be investigated and left behind. Transness historically has not meant freedom from the expectations or impositions of sex categories. It just has not, especially for trans women, right? That this, so the idea that there was some disruption there was no disruption when these, of the category woman, when these women were living their lives in the examples that I provided, right? A rapist knew that case 13 was a woman, right? A cop who was arresting these women recognized them in this pre-existent, or in this role in which trans women had always been included, right? So the idea that this is a fundamental disruption, and that the sort of body, this is what in the second instance is so compoundingly troubling, that something about a trans person's body means this thing, right? That has been ascribed to those that sort of abstracted body. Is just not supported if you think about actual genealogies of trans life and experiences of embodiment. So those are the things I could say about those examples.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. That's really, really helpful, I think, for a lot of us to think with what you just discussed. I wanted to get to something else that Alex and I were thinking about when we read your book. Is this sort of like, we read the book as also engaging with an already sort of pervasive propensity within critical scholarship to sort of find subaltern groups that might serve as a place from which you can launch critique, in a sense. And this move necessarily requires a degree of abstraction from the conditions of life of those considered on the margins. And so I thought I would just read a short paragraph, which I think is worth quoting at length, and Alex is putting it up now, which is by decolonial scholar Rabbles, who makes a similar, actually, observation about subaltern studies in his book, The Black Pacific. So I'm just going to read out that for everyone. So he says, Spivak carefully argued that subaltern studies was a politically necessary, but necessarily irresolvable intellectual project. Yet she went further than this. Because the subaltern could not appear without the thought of the elite, Spivak also proclaimed that the subaltern provided the model. Specifically, she argued that the historical predicament of the colonial subaltern could be considered the allegory of the predicament of all thought, all deliberate consciousness. Philosophically then, Spivak bade the subaltern to travel from the periphery to the center, but only to become there the recalcitrant difference that structured elite discourse. As the project was taken up in when opportunistic utilization, it was made to proffer less an opportunity to decolonize knowledge regimes and more another faculty through which to deconstruct knowledge of the Western self. Maybe you can stop the screening, Alex, thanks. Yeah, so I wondered what you thought of this quote. And I suppose also to what an extent you see your work as part of a more general critique of abstraction within academic thinking and writing.
Yeah. So I think there's a neat analog between Schillem's account of the way that the subaltern was misappropriated from Spivak's thought and incorporated into a way of just sort of speaking endlessly about the philosophical figment called the Western self or something like that, right? I think there's a neat analog between that and the way that, for example, Esther Newton's work, I'm not sure, have people read Esther Newton's work on drag, anthropological investigation of drag in the 60s in the United States, that like ethnographic work, which was like citing how people in this drag scene in like Kansas City, in small cities in the Midwest, we're talking about their performance and talking about their lives and talking about their relation to one another. and talking about the way that there was a hierarchy in that scene, where the more trans a person involved in that scene was, the lower she was on the hierarchy of social value, right? So all of those sort of particulars of again, that trans feminine genealogy of life and experience got taken up in queer theory, and all the particularity is sort of effaced, and transness became this sort of figure for how gender operates, right? Which is the reification of cisness often. So, in Spivak's thought, the sort of force of the subaltern is the destruction of colonialism, right? The destruction of coloniality and colonial ways of being. And in the transfeminist genealogy of thought, trans women and trans feminine people have articulated all different ways in which the force of transness is that it destroys cisness, that it operates, or that it is the destruction of this notion that there's an ontological difference between a penetrator and penetrated, right? That it opens up this field of theorizing embodiment that notices that all bodies are penetrable, all bodies are subject to feminization, right? But the idea here in this genealogy is that trans women don't represent that reality. Trans women, beginning in the transfeminist thought from my period of study, have produced that thought, right? Have written about bodies and modes of life in ways that communicate that the force of transness, right? So I'm in my book, I'm looking at examples from 1880, from 1890, but it's also at work in contemporary thinkers and artists like Janet Mock and Jules Gill Peterson and Tourmaline and Grace Lavery, or even working in a transfeminist tradition, the work of Sophie Lewis, right, which is talking about bodies and, for instance, the experience of gestation as an experience that exceeds the cis expectations that have been put on it, on that experience, right? So both, both the subaltern and the transfeminine in these theoretical appropriations have been created as minoritarian identities, right? Rather than as being recognized as what they are, which is socially produced resistant forces, right? And it's through this conversion of transness as a social force or alterity as a social force into an identity that can be, assigned to a figure that can then represent something, that the Academy is sort of reifying the myths that sustain it. So it's Fred Moten and Robin D.G. Kelly and Margaret Christiansen, Indigenous scholar Margie Christiansen and Billy Ray Balcour and Jody Bird, who taught me this, right? That for instance, the social force of indigeneity or Blackness or transness or the feminine or the subaltern exceed the individual person, right? And that doesn't mean that like white people or cis people or settlers or can go around saying, oh, these things are just social forces, they're not identities, so I have the right to give my voice equal weight on these matters. No, but we can say that people who are called Black or Indigenous or trans have, or anti-colonial, have a privileged relation to these social forces, right? It's Blackness, indigeneity, transness. So you can see from this answer, right? I hope that my view is clear. I'm not against abstraction in the least, or theoretical formulations, right? My understanding of the cis invention of a cis definition of transfemininity, which is my object of study after all, right? Or was my first object of study in this book, that understanding would not have been possible without Marx's value form, without Luce Irigaray on the feminine, without Fanon on how desire animates racial structures, without Denise Riley, without Leopoldina Fortunati on the definition of reproductive labor, without Hortense Spillers on the ungendering of flesh. Like all of these abstract theoretical concepts name reality, help us to name reality accurately, help us to name what power has made of us, what power has done to us, how it severed us and chopped us up from each other. My quarrel is with mystification, which I think is different from abstraction, which I know to be different from abstraction. And I think that the position of transfemininity in the origins and iterations of queer theory have been mystified. By mystification, I mean that the theoretical figure of the trans feminine in works of queer theory has been extracted from its material and historical conditions of trans feminine life, the conditions under which it makes sense and it makes knowledge and it makes resistant incursion on civilization and on cisness. And it's been a fundamentally cis project of producing metaphors and allegories out of this figure that have served conceptual ends that have nothing to do with trans life. I think that there are abstract theoretical concepts that can be derived from the genealogy of trans life. I mean, it's just been happening all along. We just have not been talking about it or like making it the center of things. Yeah, and I think that, well, anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Emma. That's really, I mean, just so instructive. So I have one final question before we go into a Q&A discussion, which is about alternatives. Because in your book, in the final chapter, you propose this alternative, what you call materialist transfeminism. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to explain what materialist transfeminism is for you. But more specifically, I wanted to ask how it avoids falling into the trap of representational politics that, for example, queer theory was hoping to escape. So, I mean, when we're arguing that, for example, materialist transfeminism is about theorizing the reality of actual trans people's lives without this move to allegorization, how can we, oh, I didn't freeze, sorry, someone else was. How can we do that without appointing ourselves as theorists, as the final arbiters of trans experience or of subaltern experiences more broadly? How do we avoid that?
Yeah, totally. You know, I really thought of that chapter as my book, less as like proposing materialist transfeminism and more as just like noticing what had been happening, what trans women had been like doing since the 1970s. You know what I mean? And like presenting it in a scholarly venue, just like a book, you know? So, and then like trying to characterize it, which did feel presumptuous to even like come up with a name to call this disparate genealogy of ways that trans women kept themselves and each other alive, right? Which is what I consider this genealogy to be, this genealogy of thought and political struggle. But I called it materialist transfeminism. So it's not a program, and it's not a self-identified group or you know, cluster of groups. It's a name for a lineage of organizing activities of trans women from the 70s to the present. And I focused on the US primarily there because those are the archives that I was in over here. But I also saw those organizing activities as being basically coextensive with less organized things that trans femmes had been doing to keep themselves alive, even back to my period of study. So just since I brought it up, that example of that trans woman, you know, finding that group of Parisian lesbians and like living with them and like having them and people helping each other find jobs, you know, in feminized fields, embroidery, domestic, you know, everywhere she goes, she's doing these things. So I saw this work in the 70s, which I was mostly interested in that cohort in the late 60s and early 70s, as being coextensive with all of these skills that trans women had used to get their healthcare by hook or by crook, to find shelter, to find food, to find sociality, to find expression, to find dates, to find all of the things that compose lives, both individual lives and collective lives. So my focus there was largely on groups of trans radicals in New York City, in Miami, in Los Angeles, who were taking these conditions of life, the things that they'd known from being, trans 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and trying to organize them into political organizations, right? To get their sisters and siblings around them these necessary things. And these women and femmes were very engaged with what were called the third world radicalisms of the time, right? So the practices of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican nationalist movement, and even anti-war radicalisms at the time. And actually, I'm working on a piece with the anthropology and indigenous studies scholar Margie Chris Jansen about the close ties between the ways in which a lot of women who were involved in these trans feminist organizations were also involved in these third world organizations. And Margie really is like totally driving that the observation that that's talking about the way in which cisness and whiteness, or non-cisness, transness, and anti-coloniality and anti-racism are imbricated in those struggles. But so this was the genealogy that I was proposing, in contrast to the theoretical genealogy that I was trying to move away from. And so the answer to the question, how do we avoid assigning ourselves the position of arbiter as academics, is of course to not do that. The answer is to look to this for the same materialist answers, or the same materialist questions in the present. What are the immediate material and spiritual needs of trans feminine communities and most marginalized members of these communities? How do we attain and act collectively to attain freedom from policing and incarceration, access to housing, food, medical care, spaces in which trans sociality and intellectual and cultural production flourish, place for autonomous control over all of these necessary resources? And the sort of methodology for achieving this is simply to listen to trans women and trans femmes and trans people, to cite trans women, to publish trans women and people. So in terms of scholarship, in addition to the books I've already recommended, I can recommend the forthcoming collection, Transgender Marxism. I have a slide that depicts that collection, but that collects all kinds of essays that are, different kinds of reflections and investigations and dispatches from the present, landscape of trans struggle and trans life from a materialist Marxist perspective. I can also recommend the work of the emerging scholar Beans Velosi, who's starting a job at UPenn next year, and whose work is investigating the way that science invented cisness and transness in relation to eugenics and race medicine in the early 20th century. We can also, so that's the sort of scholarly side of things. Then in terms of this idea of listening to trans women, we can listen to community organizations who are tending to the material needs of trans women and trans communities. So in my community of Queens, New York, that looks like the organization Red Canary Song in Flushing, right up here, who are working to decriminalize sex work and focusing on the needs of women of color sex workers and trans women of color sex workers. It looks like in my local context, working to support the overturning of local laws that are used to criminalize trans women of color. So in New York City, there was this anti-loitering ordinance, which, when you looked at it, the ordinance just said people can't hang out on with no purpose in public space. But the way that it was used was to arrest trans women who were suspected or, just trans women, right? And there was a campaign that was called Repeal the Walking While Trans Ordinance. So the ordinance was sort of given the name of its reality, of the way that it was implemented. And it was overturned. Another sort of way to get at this reality is in the United States, there were these two bills called FOSTA and SESTA, which were which passed the National Congress and made it put in place all these new restrictions on online operation of sex work sort of communication pathways, which was really devastating for people in terms of, online negotiation and operation of sex work stuff being safer. There's the organization GLITS, which is an acronym for Gays and Lesbians Living in a Transgender Society. And the co-founder, Cayenne Doroshow, put together this model where where the organization crowdsourced a bunch of money to find housing for Black trans women and trans women of color, and they bought a house, right? So on the national scale in the U.S., I follow the work of Chase Strangio, who's the point person at the ACLU for a legal strategy for beating back. In the States right now, we're dealing with this reality where state by state, these bills, the language of which has been written and then distributed to all the different states to do state level bills, are focusing just a lot of attention on making it illegal for trans kids to participate in sports, right? In athletics, in K through 12 athletics. And these are just popping up all over, and organizations all over the country are trying to beat them down or trying to address them. And the ACLU and this lawyer, Chase Strangio, is sort of keeping track of all this. Yeah, and in the UK, I know there's a lot of energy around the Gender Recognition Act, and I'd love to know about what community level work is going on in London and elsewhere where people are calling in from. So that's it, that's how we avoid the pitfalls of approaching trans life as an abstraction, by investigating it as a reality, as a field of experience that is both internally diverse, widely internally diverse, but also has these concerns around which we can gather. And I just think to sort of answer the institutional question that you're asking, Alex, I'm inspired by Fred Moten and Stefano Heaney, who say, to the university we steal, and there we steal, right? We take this infrastructure that has produced so many brutal abstractions of lives that are actually lived, and converted them into tools that do nothing for those lives and communities. We go to that place, the university, and we see what we can make of it, and we hold ourselves responsible. I think it's a cop-out for academics, and we try and do better, and we, engage criticism of our own methods and our own work. I think it's a cop-out for academics to say, oh, how could I possibly do anything? I'm just up here on my pillar, right? We're workers. We live in communities. In the US, and from what I know of the UK, we're increasingly precarious workers, right? And I think this idea of the sort of elite academy is formed around conditions of life and labor that are based on sort of, in the States, Ivy League and Ivy peer institutions, that those conditions are getting rarer and rarer. And so I think we should move with the ways in which the precarity of academic life is no longer even allowing us that cop-out of being like, we're just too freaking elite to ever know anything, right? That's my answer.
Nee, sagen wir mal, diese Grundidee von Kommunismus, ne, die ist ja voll geil. 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 Die ist ja voll geil.
Однако русские коммунисты выстоят. Есть бывали трудности. Добились правды.